The Paternal Metaphor IV, Part 4 of 4. It is essential to hold in mind this schema because it also shows you that for this to happen correctly, completely, and in the right directions, there has to be a certain relationship between its direction, its correctness, its mishaps, and the development of the therefore always increasing presence of the father in the dialectic of the relationship between the infant and the mother. This schema, with its double alternating movement, i.e., that reality is mastered by the human subject insofar as it reaches a certain one of these limits in the virtual form of the body image, and that, in a corresponding way, it is insofar as the subject inserts into the field of experience the unreal elements of the signifier, that he manages to enlarge the field of this experience to the extent that it is enlarged for the human subject. This is something that needs to be in constant use, and without referring to it, you will find yourselves perpetually sliding into a series of confusions that consist in literally making silk purses out of sow's ears by taking an idealization for an identification, an illusion for an image, all sorts of things that are far from being equivalent, and to which we will have to come back later and by referring to this schema. It is very clear, for example, that the conception that we can make of the phenomenon of delirium is something that should be easily indicated by the structure put, promoted, made manifest in this schema, insofar as we always see in cases of delirium something that definitely merits the term regressive, but not in a way that is a kind of reproduction of the anterior state. This would be truly totally abusive. For example, to confuse this phenomenon with the notion that the infant lives in a world of delirium, for example, which seems to be implied by the Kleinian conception, is one of the hardest things to accept. For the good reason that this psychotic phase, if it is necessitated by the premises of Kleinian theory, we have no evidence with infants of anything that might represent a transitory psychotic state. On the contrary, we can very well conceptualize in the form of a regression, which is structural rather than genetic, which can be illustrated with the schema, precisely by an inverse movement to the one that is indicated by the two arrows. The invasion into the world of body image objects, which is so conspicuous, I'm talking about deliriums like Judge Schwaber's, and inversely here, this something that gathers around the ego or the signifying phenomenon, right up to the point where the subject is no longer, in some way, contained as an ego except by this fabric of continuous signifying verbal hallucinations that constitute at that moment a kind of folding back towards an initial position in the genesis of his world of reality. To cut a long story short, let's look at what we are aiming at today. Our aim is to definitively locate the meaning of the question that we are asking in relation to the object. The question of the object for us analysts is fundamentally this one. Because we are constantly experiencing it, that's all we have to do to keep ourselves occupied. What is the source and the genesis of this illusory object? It is a question of knowing if we can create ourselves a sufficient conception of this object as illusory simply by referring to categories of the imaginary. I will answer that no, that is impossible, because the illusory object, and this is because it has been known about for an extremely long time, since there have been people who think and philosophers who try to express what everyone experiences. Everyone knows that the illusory object has been talked about for a long time. It's the veil of Maya. This is the reason why it would seem that a need, such as the one that is called the sexual need, manifestly achieves goals that are beyond, if we can say so, whatever is in the interior of the subject. We did not have to wait for Freud. Mr. Schopenhauer and plenty of others had already before him seen in it nature's ruse, which means that the subject believes he is kissing a particular woman when he is purely and simply submitting to the needs of the species. This aspect of the fundamentally imaginary characteristic of the object, very much especially insofar as it is the object of sexual need, has been known about for a long time, and has not made us make a step forward with this problem, which is, however, the essential problem. Why does this same need, which would be, let's say, made from what roughly apparently seems very well to be achieved in nature with the characteristics of allure, from the fact that the subject is only aware of the image of the female of his species, roughly speaking, why does this not make us make a step forward in the sense that for man, a little thing like a woman's boot can very precisely be what provokes in him this upsurge of energy, let's say, destined to result in the reproduction of the species? That is the problem. That is the problem, and the problem can only be solved insofar as you realize that the object that it is about, insofar as it is an illusory object, only fulfills its function in the human subject, not as an image, so alluring, so naturally well organized as you may suppose allure to be, but as a signifying element in a signifying chain. I will come back to this. We are on the verge of a perhaps extra especially abstract lesson today. Please accept my apologies. But if we don't put it in these terms, we will never be able to arrive at an understanding of what is here and what is there, what I am saying and what I am not saying, what I am saying in contradiction to others, and what the others say completely innocently without being aware of their contradictions. It is necessary to go through it in this way, according to the role that this or that object plays, fetish or not, but even simply an instrumentation of perversion. You would truly have to have your head I don't know where to be satisfied with terms such as masochism and sadism, for example, something that naturally provides all sorts of splendid suppositions on the stages, the instincts, on the fact that there is I don't know what aggressive motor response needed simply to make it possible to achieve the goal of genital attachment. But, in the end, why is it that in this sadism and in this masochism, the fact of being beaten, there are other ways of exercising sadism and masochism, the fact of being beaten very precisely with a switch, or whatever is analogous, plays an essential role. And to minimize the importance in human sexuality of this particularly special instrument, that we usually call a whip, in a more or less elided, symbolic, generalized way, this is all the same something that merits some consideration. Mr. Aldous Huxley describes for us a future world where everything will be so well organized in relation to the instinct for reproduction that little fetuses will purely and simply be put in bottles after those who are destined to be able to provide the best seeds have been chosen. Everything goes very well, and the world becomes something so especially satisfactory that Mr. Aldous Huxley, as a result of his personal preferences, declares it to be fundamentally boring. We are not going to take sides, but what is interesting is that an author who lends himself to these kinds of predictions, to which we do not see anything of any importance for us, brings back to life the world he knows, and us too, via the intermediary of a girl who exhibits a need to be whipped. For him, it seems there is no doubt that there is something in this that is closely linked to the character of humanity in the world. This is simply what I want to highlight for you. I want to highlight for you that what is accessible in a novel, and to someone who no doubt has experience of sexual life, is all the same also something that for us, analysts, should make us stop, i.e., that if the whole tendency, for example, of the history of perversion in analytical theory, i.e., the moment when we left behind the notion that perversion is purely and simply the drive revealing itself, meaning the opposite to neurosis, it had to wait for a sign from the conductor of the orchestra, meaning the moment when Freud wrote, "A child is being beaten." And that it is on the basis of this absolutely totally sublime study, because clearly everything that has been said since is nothing but the small change left over from what is in there, it is on the basis of this whip fantasy that Freud truly, at that moment there, brought perversion into its own analytic dialectic. There where it seems to be, not the manifestation of a pure and simple drive, but to be connected to a dialectical context just as subtle, composite, just as rich in compromise, just as ambiguous as in neurosis. It is precisely given something that is going, not to class perversion as a category of our instinctual tendencies, but as something that precisely articulates it in detail, according to its substance and, let's say the word, according to its signifier. Besides, every time that you have to deal with a perversion, there is something that corresponds to a kind of méconnaissance of what you have in front of you if you don't see how much the perversion is connected in a fundamental way to a kind of role-playing fabric that, besides which, is susceptible to being transformed, being modified, being developed, being enriched. That is even the whole story of perversion. The fact that perversion, on the other hand, is linked in the closest possible way in certain cases, I mean clinically from experience, to the appearance, to the disappearance, to the whole compensatory movement of a phobia that, itself, clearly shows the duration of the situation and its reverse, l'endroit et l'envers, but in an altogether different way, in a way in which the two articulated systems self-form and self-compensate and alternate between each other. It is also something that helps us to create an articulation of the drive in a completely different domain from this one of pure and simple tendencies. It is to this point, to the signifying accent to which these elements respond, the material of the perversion itself, that I particularly want to bring your attention, since, for the moment, it is about signifying what it's about in relation to the object. What does all this mean? It means that we have an object, a primordial object, that, without any doubt, continues to dominate the life of the subject in what follows. We also have, without any doubt and with certainty, certain imaginary elements that play the crystallizing role, and particularly everything that comprises the matter of the body apparatus, the body parts, and the way the subject refers to what dominates these body parts, the global image. But the fact that, fait que, the object is taken up by a function that is that of the signifier, and that means that, fait que, in this relation constituted by the existence of the signifying chain, such that we can symbolize it as a series of S, S dashed, S double dashed, and that there would be underneath it this series of significations that means that, fait que, even if the upper chain progresses in a certain direction, the something that progresses in the opposite direction in the significations, or underneath, is a signification that always slides, trots along and reveals itself which means that, fait que, in the end, the fundamental relation between man and all signification, due to the fact that, fait que, the signifier exists, is a special kind of object. This object, I call it the metonymic object. I am telling you that its core principle, as the subject relates to it, is insofar as the subject, her himself, imaginatively identifies in a completely radical way, not with this or that object function that responds to this or that partial tendency, as it is said, but that there is something that necessitates that there is there somewhere a pole, i.e., in the imaginary, something that represents that which always reveals itself, i.e., that which induces a certain escaping flow of the object in the imaginary due to the fact that the signifier exists. This object here, it has a name. It is the pivot. It is central to the whole dialectic of perversions, of neuroses, and even purely and simply to all subjective development. It is called the phallus, and that is what I will illustrate for you next time.